Well, what we were trying to do was to understand the relationship between the sorts of management actions that people might make or do for RED and the likely impacts on carbon and biodiversity. And that required us to think through the actions and then to explore the literature, the scientific literature for good assessments of the impacts of those actions. We found that the actions are incredibly variable and that the factors that dictate what their impacts are also variable, and that we were able to draw a few conclusions about issues that countries and practitioners will have to pay attention to as they start to implement RED+ management, but that there were an awful lot of gaps, particularly in relation to specific forest types and in relation to the conditions that led to more or less positive or negative outcomes particularly for biodiversity.
Bhaskar, it kind of highlights the challenge of having one policy which covers such a diverse, I guess, subject area.
Yeah, actually that's very much at the heart of what we were finding in the work that we were doing. You're trying to maximize goals across 3 or 4 different dimensions and trying to do that with a single instrument, and it's always very challenging. One of the interesting things that emerges from the literature though is that a full integration of some of those social economic objectives early on in the process can be really useful in terms of even meeting your environmental objectives, because you get much more participation, because you get much more involvement of the local communities who might actually then stand to benefit from these interventions. The effectiveness of your intervention might actually improve. So we have about 4 really high-level messages that we wanted to talk about, and one of them is to see that synergies are possible, but we shouldn't take them for granted. You have to work hard to achieve them. Increasingly, people were talking some years ago about low-hanging fruit. It's not low-hanging. It's tough. You've got to climb very many ladders to get to that fruit. You've got to work really hard.
Fall down a few times
and fall down a few times along the way. So but done right, there are possibilities that might actually help you to achieve those multiple goals. But we shouldn't take for granted that we're going to get it right. And that means that one has to take it really seriously. The second big message was we need to learn from past experience. We've done interventions in the forestry sector for decades. There's a wealth of information which is relevant to RED+, and we can learn a lot from that. Who's benefited, who's lost, how has power been distributed, who are the beneficiaries in terms of the elite groups who might seek to capture benefits, especially when money is involved, when RED involves potentially a lot of money. So that's the second high-level message. The third message is that increasingly, officially, we're talking the language of safeguards. But again, our findings that integrating social objectives at an early stage might actually want us to say more than just safeguards. The language of safeguards is perhaps a little bit too defensive. It kind of accepts that there's a negative social consequence and you've got to protect against it. You might actually want a more positive embracing of the social objective. And our final kind of conclusion is that despite our best efforts, there are going to be situations where trade-offs will happen. We have to not be fooled into thinking that there are easy win-wins, that there's going to be win-win all the time. Yeah. And then decision makers need to decide what they want to prioritize. Is the environmental objective overriding, or are they going to take the social and economic objectives seriously and try and do something about it?
Valerie, are there dangers that RED, if it was implemented without these safeguards that we're talking about, could be ecologically damaging?
Almost certainly, especially if people take a single benefit or a single focus on the carbon. There are many ways to increase carbon that would have absolutely disastrous consequences ecologically, including plantation of exotic species, including plantation of trees in non-forest ecosystems. The biodiversity consequences of those sorts of actions would be potentially catastrophic. So actually having this kind of balanced view of the trade-offs, even within the environmental benefits, not to mention with the social and economic benefits, is absolutely crucial to making some sort of sound decision about what to do next.
It seems to me, being in no way an expert whatsoever, but it seems we're quite a long way from actually seeing effective RED projects hit the ground. It's a bit like the big talk about, carbon capture sequestration. Everyone says this is the big silver bullet, but are we? How far away are we from actually seeing real effective projects?
I think, as Bhaskar said, there's a lot of experience of relevant projects and interventions, a lot of which isn't very well documented, and that's actually one of the things we ran into, that there's much more out there than we were able to find in the time available. So I think there's a lot that we can draw on. I think there are some successful experiences which aren't done for red. No, we're not there and ready to slot projects into mechanism, but we do have experience that we can draw on to get better about what we plan for the mechanism as it takes shape.
It is a real challenge for us because the way these reviews are conducted, they're based on the evidence that's out there. But because there isn't a lot of implementation experience with RED, it was very difficult to actually review an experience of RED projects if we define them very narrowly. So we had to broaden our definition and look at forest sector interventions across a very large landscape, and in fact agricultural interventions as well. So we sort of broadened to look at the landscape level interventions that take place and the knowledge that we have about the impacts that they've had, and learn from them the things that we should be careful about when RED gets implemented. Obviously the sort of formal official RED process is going to go through a tortuous process of negotiation. So for it to actually become a reality is still a long way off, but there is experience on the ground that we can learn from.
And I mean, are we talking about conservation or restoration? What's the main focus for RED? Because it seems in different countries they're talking about different issues.
That's exactly it. Depending on national circumstances and indeed local circumstances, engagement with the RED mechanism is going to involve different kinds of activities. I mean, the ultimate goal is reducing emissions or sequestering more carbon. And if you haven't got much forest, then, or if you've lost a lot of forest, then you're looking at enhancing forest carbon stocks, largely through restoration. If you've got a lot of forest and it's under pressure, then you're looking at reducing that pressure. And if you've got a lot of forest and it's not yet under pressure, you're looking at trying to make sure it doesn't become under pressure and that it's well managed. So a full range of interventions. Globally, there's a place for everything. Locally and nationally, a different balance of efforts is going to be relevant in each place.
And what's interesting is that for all of those different circumstances, there is evidence of what happens. For instance, when we introduce protected areas, which might be one of the measures, we know what happens with protected areas. There's a lot of evidence based on people having done studies of the social and economic impacts of protected areas. So we can learn from these things. Yeah. So every intervention that we're looking at, actually there is some relevant experience that we can draw on, which might help us understand what might happen. What might happen if we have plantations? What might happen if we have intensification of the agricultural landscape? These are things that have happened in other contexts, maybe not with RED as their ultimate objective, but we can learn about how people react to those and what incentives emerge from those.
Yeah, we have a basis for more informed decisions, but we don't have a perfect knowledge. We're a very long way off the latter.
And in terms of moving forward, how optimistic are you that your findings will be taken on board by the people that matter, and that we'll see real RED projects being rolled out in the next decade or so?
Well, I would hope that there would be RED projects that are sensitive to the sorts of things that our findings are pointing to, which are sort of lots of warning lights going off and saying we need to do this very carefully and design it properly, because otherwise the risks associated with them going ahead and not taking account of the kinds of things we're talking about are actually very great. Whether I can predict that this kind of work will necessarily achieve that outcome is obviously impossible to say at this stage. I'd hope in forums like this and through IUFRO, which coordinated the work, it will be promoted at policy forums. So the report is being released at the UNFCCC. It's also going to feed into the UN Forum on Forests next year. So the intention is very much that this is not a report just written for an intellectual or academic community to debate amongst themselves, but to have real impact. So summaries for decision makers are being written, and we're hoping that people will find them of value when they think about implementation projects.
Yep, I don't have much to add to that. Certainly the response here has been very positive and very interested. There was a very stimulating discussion, which bodes well for it actually having impact, because if people find things to question and in some cases disagree with, but also things to applaud, which is what we saw, there's much more likely to be uptake through the diversity of response, I think.